Hey guys, in this video I will convince you that painting a full suit of non-metallic metal armor on a Mini is easier than you think, and you can do it too. I know that non-metallic metal can seem like one of the most intimidating things in mini painting, and people tend to look at it as the ultimate fancy technique that you use to show that you are better than the peasants who don't use it.
And let's be fair, it's not the easiest thing in the world and it's a bit of a flex, but at the same time it can look great, and when done right, it looks much better than something done with true metallic metal paints. You can try to argue with that in the comments, but deep down you know it's true. But what is more important is that all the techniques used for painting it will help you paint any other material better as well. Therefore, mastering non-metallic metal will make you a better painter all around, plain and simple. So if you ask me, any painter should try to master it to a certain degree. And you can start on the easier end of things and paint only smaller parts of a Mini, like the armor trim on your Space Marines for example, in which case I suggest watching my video from a couple of weeks back about painting gold trim. Or if you're a firm believer in going big or going home, you can skip that and go for the holy grail, painting the entire armor of a Mini non-metallic. Then this video is for you. I will demonstrate how to paint bluish metal armor on this infinity tag, the Mechazoid Sokorentai, but the same technique works on any armored Mini including Space Marines as well. I will paint a vanilla version first without any secondary lights, but in the second half of the video I'll also show you how you can add a glow effect in case you really want to show those true metal lovers what is what. And in this video I will focus on the non-metallic metal parts of the model, but if you want to know how I painted the whole thing from 0 to 100, what paints I used and all the details of this project, I'll post the PDF guides and the real-time painting footage on my Patreon as usual, so check that out. Oh, and there is still time to sign up for the first ever Phalanx Miniatures painting contest sponsored by Greenstock World. You can find the details in the video description.
Alright, let's paint some non-metallic metal, and the first thing you will need is a plan for the colors you want to use, and I don't always follow my plan, but it's still good to have one.
And this time the plan was to use these colors, a nice progression from dark purple shadows to bluish grey midtones all the way to pure white in the brightest highlights. You can paint non-metallic metal with very different colors from this. For example, I love doing it with green tones, but blue is what most people imagine when painting metal. Don't be intimidated by the number of paints. The amount of effort you need to put in with these varies quite a bit. With the darker colors you have to cover a lot of surface, but you don't have to be super precise with them or put in a lot of thought where you paint them. The middle colors are where the magic happens, because with these you still have to cover quite a bit of surface, but now you have to also be precise, and where you paint them matters a lot. And on the brighter end of the spectrum things become easier again. Here you have to be precise, but you barely have to cover anything and you don't have to make big decisions about the light placement anymore. I usually start from a black primer and work my way up from the darker colors to the brighter ones. And the first thing I do is to cover the black primer with a very dark purple base coat, black purple from AK Interactive in this case. I simply cover all the elements with this fully using a big size 2 brush, leaving none of the original black primer visible. The difference between the black and the purple is not huge at first glance, but on the final result it will make quite a bit of a difference. Black is the most boring thing ever. It's not even a real color, just an absence of it, so we simply replace it with something that is almost as dark but adds a little to the colors of our metal. We will cover most of this by the end, but we will still be able to see a hint of this purple in the final result. Now we are ready to do some real highlighting, and for this I will actually mix the same dark purple with the next color in the plan, anthracite gray. I do a nice 50-50 mix of the two colors. And this is the only time we will be mixing colors in this tutorial. For the rest of the highlights I'll go with paint straight out of the bottle, but I find that mixing my shadow color with the first highlight makes my life easier, since the mix blends nicely with the base coat and I don't need to do much smoothing at all. And where I paint this is pretty simple. I cover about 80-90% of every panel, but I leave a little of the darker color on one end. Usually I leave the dark area at the bottom end of the element if possible, but if that is not an option then either end will work. And in the areas I don't cover, I do at least some very rough edge highlights and some lines and scratches at the border between the two colors to make the transition more fuzzy and less obvious. The idea here is to make one end of every panel brighter and the other darker with a transition in the middle. Once done, we simply have to make the difference between the two, what we call contrast, so big that it will look like metal. I am simplifying this quite a bit, but essentially this is how it works. Okay, time to increase that contrast using the pure anthracite gray, this time without any purple mixed in. And for this I will switch to a smaller brush. Up until this point I was using a large size 2, but now I changed to a size 1 so I can be a little bit more precise. And I basically repeat what I did before. I highlight every edge on the armor panels, then I make a big solid patch inside the big highlight I made with the previous mix, but I leave about 20-30% of the previous color still visible. And on the border between the two colors I make some lines, scratches and dots to fuzzy up the transition area. But now, even with these, the difference between the two colors is too jarring, so we need to smooth things out a little. I think paint down the same anthracite grey with some extra water, about 80% water and 20% paint, and I glaze this from the dark area over the scratches and dots and into the highlight, ending my brush stroke there. I repeat this a couple of times, waiting for each layer to dry before I apply the next one. An important thing to note here is that areas that are fully in the light should be brighter, while the ones turned away from the light need to be darker. And you can achieve this easily by making the highlight areas smaller in the shadows and making them bigger in the lights. A good example of this is the left knee pad, where the outer panel has to be lighter because it's more in the light, so I painted a bigger highlight, while the inner side is more in the shadows, so I gave it a smaller light. Alright, time to make things even brighter, so the next color will be dark blue-gray, which despite the name is actually lighter than the previous one. And believe it or not, I will do the exact same thing again, edge highlights, solid highlights, fuzzy texture on the border and glazes of the same color to smooth things out. But I made a couple of subtle changes, and at this point we need to talk about another important rule as well. And the changes are simple. I don't highlight every single edge anymore, I concentrate on the ones in the light areas more and I leave the ones in the shadows unpainted with the brighter color. Plus I also start to be more precise with my edge highlights and my line work in general. So far I haven't been really making them super thin and crisp, but now I try to pay attention to this more. And now about that rule. You know how we made the darker and the lighter side on each panel? Well, that works most of the time, but it's not entirely correct. For example, look at the armor on the left arm. That thing is fully exposed to the light, so it should be much lighter in general than the other panels that are angled away from the light coming from above. What this means for us is that the light area should be much bigger and the shadow area should be smaller but also much brighter than on the other less exposed panels. Not observing this rule is very easy. As you can see, I did it here as well. I will notice it towards the end of the paint job and I will fix it so you will be able to see the difference if you stick around. And if you want to learn more about this rule, I made a video about it, so check that out. Alright, if we put the end result of this step and the previous one next to each other, we can kinda see where this is going, but the contrast is not there yet. But before we push the brightness even higher, there is a little housekeeping I like to do, and I suggest you pay attention to this as well. I take a size 00 brush so I can be as precise as possible, and using the original black purple, I make sure that every panel is separated from each other by a dark line and all the recessed areas are nice and dark. This dark lining is super important to keep the model looking neat and defined. I will keep reinforcing this throughout the entire paint job, making sure that I get a nice crisp definition in the end. Okay, let's go brighter again, and now things are becoming more interesting and difficult at the same time. From this point on, to go brighter, I need to use paints that have a lot of white mixed in them. And these are much more difficult to blend into the surrounding colors, and with them any mistake will be way more obvious than with the previous ones. But I still do the same technique as before: edge highlights, big highlights inside the previous one, diagonal lines and scratches on the border, and smoothing with glazes. But now I switch to an even smaller brush, a size 0 from Abteilung, and I make all my lines even thinner and crisper than before. I also restrict the edges I paint to those in the light areas, leaving more and more of them in the shadowy areas not painted with the brighter colors. It is also worth mentioning that you don't have to use every color everywhere when it comes to the solid highlights either. In the darker parts of the Mini, it is enough to add 1 or 2 steps of highlights, so at this point I'm only painting solid highlights with this in the light areas. And I use more glazes on the borders to make the transition smoother despite the white. As you can see, this color improved the contrast quite dramatically compared to the previous one, but it's still not enough. We need to push the difference between the shadows and the highlights even further. And to achieve that, the next color will be medium gray, which is very close to white with just a hint of blue in it. I do the same routine again, but this time I reduce the size of the highlights even more and I concentrate them more on the top half of the model and on the areas most exposed to the light. And I switch to an even smaller brush, a size 00 from Green Stuff World this time, trying to make my lines as thin and crisp as I can make them. At this stage it's important to not go overboard and make these very white highlights too big. We need to keep the previous, more obviously bluish color still visible. But if I go overboard, I can simply come back with a glaze of the previous colors to bring back the blue tone and smooth things out at the same time. As I said in the beginning, at this stage all I need to do is to be precise and pay attention not to over-highlight, but there is not much thinking required since I simply operate in the highlights I established in the previous steps. And compared to the previous stages, this one takes much less time as well because there is not that much surface to cover. And we might not cover much, but the effect is still quite obvious. We are almost there with the contrast, we just need the final touches. So finally, with pure white, I only paint some of the edges and corners that are the most exposed to the light. I really try to be as neat and crisp with this as I can. Any smudgy or too thick lines with this will stand out like a sore thumb, so it's better to take your time here. We cover only a tiny area, so no need to rush anything. Sometimes I don't even fully paint an edge, but only do the highlight on the part that is is closest to the light, and then I finish it with a couple of dots, leaving the rest darker. And occasionally it's worth highlighting an edge that is in a darker area but is facing the light. This creates even more contrast, but don't overdo this, otherwise it will look unnatural. Alright, with that our basic non-metallic metal on the armor is done, and it looks pretty cool already, so we could just leave it like this, or we can make it even fancier and realistic looking with some light reflections. For this I will paint in some of the other elements on the model, like the red armor panels and the glowing power swords. I won't go into details about how I did those, but if you want to know more about them and all the other elements on the model, then check out the guides on Patreon. Okay, so now we have two glowing yellowish green swords that would probably reflect on the shiny metal armor, so let's make that happen. I will do this with a single color, laser yellow from AK Interactive. This is one of my favorite paints in the range, you can use it for so many things, it's crazy. And to get the glow effect with it, all I needed to do was to highlight the edges and to glaze in some green highlights onto the panels which were facing the swords directly. But we need to observe a couple of rules to make this look good. The first rule is that the glow the sword creates on the armor can be brighter than the actual sword. This is easily taken care of by using the laser yellow, which is not as bright as the highest highlights on the sword. The second rule is that the closer something is to the sword and the more it's facing it, the more the glow would show up on it. Therefore, elements that were right next to the sword got full highlights and edge highlights on the edges facing the glowing blades. If something was further away, it only got some edge highlights on the edges facing the blades, but no solid highlights. And things even further away remained unchanged. Finally, the last rule is that the glow can only make things brighter, not darker. So I painted the glow mostly in the shadow areas of the panels where they serve as a secondary highlight, but I made sure to not cover the shadows fully so I don't destroy the contrast I created earlier. I built up my layers slowly and used some glazes of the previous color to blend things together with the green. Okay, with the glow effect finished, we are almost done, but I promised to show how I fixed the incorrect lights and the shadows on the arm. I simply went back in with glazes of the same colors I used for the non-metallic metal, and I changed two things. I increased the size of the highlights and I made the shadows much lighter. There is still a transition from lighter to darker, but the difference is much smaller, so the contrast on the individual element got less, but now it creates more contrast on the overall model. And with that done, the final result looks like this. As you can see, painting non-metallic metal is not exactly rocket science, and by following the process and the rules I explained here, you can do it too. It definitely has a learning curve, and I am improving with every new attempt as well. But all the techniques, the edge highlights, the smoothing transitions with glazes, the light placement and so forth are all useful no matter what you paint, so by painting non-metallic metal you are also improving your painting skills in general. I hope this video will help you paint better non-metallic metal or maybe push you into trying it out for the first time. If you have any questions or concerns, share them in the comments or jump into the new Phalanx Miniatures Discord and share them there. You will find the link in the description. If you like the video, do me a solid and subscribe, like and comment. It really helps with the algorithm showing it to other people. And as usual, before I sign off, I wanted to thank my Patreon members for all their support. Without them, this channel would not exist, and that is especially true for the ones in the captain level. Thank you guys, see you in the next one.